Martin George joins me on the Zoom line this morning. Of course, Martin wears different caps, but indeed we of course recognize his contribution as a former Police Service Commission member. So when discussions come up surrounding that talking point, Martin is always one that we seek some counsel. He understands this and the runnings of the particular commission on an intimate level. Martin, always great to see you. Thanks for the time, and I look forward to your perspective this morning.
Yes, hi, good morning to you, Jason, and good morning to your viewers on CNC3, and good morning, Trinidad and Tobago.
Indeed, good morning to the country and the wider audience looking at us on Facebook and YouTube all over the globe. So I'm guided by The Guardian this morning, the House to debate the Police Service Commission members. The House of Representatives will this afternoon debate the nominations for 5 members, and I'm seeing a couple of different folks here featured in The Guardian. I guess normal standard procedure. After the debate, what will transpire? What's the next move after this debate once all the dots aligned, cross the T's and dot the I's?
Okay, so the thing is, we're dealing with Section 122 of the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, and it says that there shall be a Police Service Commission which shall consist of a chairman and 4 other members. The members are appointed by the president in accordance with this section, right? So the president, after consultation with the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition, shall nominate persons who are qualified and experienced in the disciplines of law, finance, sociology, or management to be appointed as members of the Police Service Commission. So you must ensure that you cover those criteria amongst your nominees. Right? If you recall the seminal case of Reginald Dumas versus Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago and the Police Service Commission, where he went all the way to the Privy Council to challenge the appointment of certain persons to a former version of the Police Service Commission. And the Privy Council actually held that, yes, he did have the right to mount such a challenge, even just as an interested citizen. So it's very important to ensure that you follow the criteria set out in law, because it is clear from what the Privy Council ruled in that matter with Reginald Dumas, you can have a challenge to the composition of the Police Service Commission being successfully mounted if it is that you don't follow these criteria.
Okay.
So once you have these criteria covered, it then goes before the Parliament.
Well, I'm seeing the likes of Maxine Atong and others who would have been there. They're going to exit, so they're going to make room now for, again, as you mentioned, some new names are being thrown around. What's the process? They're going to vet these people, and once they're able to, the mere fact your name is being called at this point, I'm sure the vetting process already happened. But ultimately,
right.
So walk me through, ultimately, when they're chosen, what happens really? What's the role and function of the commission? So just let's walk me through the layers.
Yes, so one would imagine that the vetting process would have occurred already, and that these persons would have, definitely met the criteria as set out in law in terms of covering those areas. And then the president would issue the notification in relation to each person nominated, right, for appointment. And this now is subject to affirmative resolution of the House of Representatives. So that's what is going to take place today, the debate and discussion on them, and then that's subject to affirmative resolution, which basically means you're looking for a simple majority of the Parliament.
I guess this is one of the unique appointments in the country where both the Prime Minister and the opposition leader are actually given a voice to more or less ventilate and to, I guess, bring forward a suggestion based on what I'm seeing. The president proposed a name based on the Prime Minister's and opposition leader's recommendation. Is that the case?
Right, yes, but it's not unique in that regard. In fact, there are several other high offices in Trinidad and Tobago where you have a similar requirement for consultation. However, we must remember the case of Jimmy Bain versus the Public Service Commission and the Attorney General, which was the matter which decided what consultation in such a case actually means. Consultation in such a case simply means that I have given you the opportunity to express your views. So it doesn't mean that your views necessarily carry any weight in terms of the persons whom I would eventually nominate. But I must give you the opportunity to express your views. So that's, and that has also been decided all the way up to the Privy Council. So that's what consultation in such a case means.
Understood. Ultimately, what's your role and function for those looking at us this morning? Because I know you would have said picking the top cup and stuff is a bit problematic. You would have mentioned that many times. But ultimately, what's the role and function here of this commission?
Right. So the commission is supposed to monitor and evaluate and assess the executives of the TTPS, right, primarily being the commissioner and the deputy commissioners, in terms of how they manage the entire police service. So therefore, they are supposed to superintend and manage that process. They're supposed to carry out assessments, tests, measurements. They're supposed to collect data. They're supposed to set targets, goals, criteria. They're supposed to ensure that these things are being met or that they're being followed. They're supposed to have regular meetings with the commissioner and the deputy commissioners to ensure that each person is on track with what they're supposed to be doing. So in an ideal world, Jason, the commission is supposed to function in such a way that we ought not to be having problems in Trinidad and Tobago with our police service. But as you can, very well imagine, the reality is quite the opposite. So, it calls for questioning as to the way the PSC is either structured or managed or, run. And one of the things that we did while I was there during the 9 years that I served as a commissioner, we suggested that there should be permanent commissioners. And you can probably have, a few that are rotating, but you should have a core of permanent commissioners who would serve at least like maybe a 5 or 7 year term, if you understand me. And the reason for that being, Jason, the learning curve is very steep. In other words, the amount of things you have to familiarize yourself with when you come into this commission, it is really, really overwhelming. And for part-time commissioners, particularly persons who are busy with their other lives in terms of, other portfolios and other hats they wear, it's a whole lot to digest. And, the number of reports you have to go through, they're quite voluminous. So it's really, really a lot that each new incoming commission has to learn. So if you keep, rotating these people every 3 years or whatever, then it really makes it difficult to get some sense of consistency in terms of your approach and your management and development of the TTPS as a functioning unit.
And in that regard, do you think there should be a different kind of consideration when looking at the vocation? Because you would have mentioned earlier, a couple minutes ago, people within the realm of sociology, of course, you have a legal background. What are other considerations really that probably we could look at to spread it, to give it more spread as it pertains to people who are chosen to be part of this commission?
Right. So the thing is, the Constitution at present speaks of the disciplines of law, finance, sociology, or management. I think maybe they should also include, someone with some sort of operational experience in maybe either the security industry or, maybe the armed forces or, that kind of thing. I think that type of expertise can be useful. I remember when I was a commissioner, one of our iterations of the commission, we had, Major Franklin, from the Defense Force. And, there were some insights he brought to the table which were useful. But the point is, it's not mandatory that you must have someone with that type of law enforcement experience. But I think maybe that could be something that they could add if it is that they have to look at, expanding the criteria for the appointment of members. But I think definitely having some permanent members and maybe some others that you then rotate maybe on a 3-year basis would be a much better fit in terms of ensuring that there's some sense of continuity and the transfer of the institutional knowledge. Because if you replace all 5 each time, I mean, I understand that there may be one person that they might have, put back again. But the point is that may not be enough in the circumstances.
So this commission, it's, from what I understand, an independent body, yes?
It is.
So I must ask the question, is there interference or attempted interference? I mean, we have seen...
You get that all the time. You get the calls, the messages, the whispers at a party, a cocktail function, you get it all the time. But of course, you just have to be true to your oath and to your duty to Trinidad and Tobago and recognize that at the end of the day, you are here to serve the people of Trinidad and Tobago, not the politicians who, for one reason or another, may want this candidate or that candidate or may not want this candidate or that candidate.
And I would imagine that interference is all in an attempt to control, obviously, because if you're able to control the commission will now put someone who ultimately you could, tell them move left, jump right.
Right. Okay. Yes. So if you recall, when the a previous version of the commission, spectacularly imploded. That was one of the allegations that was raised, in terms of, whether there was some attempt at interference or not.
So is there different, I mean, obviously, not want to scrap things that are already established, but could we go a different direction to basically prevent that possibility of happening again? Or is this, the way forward?
I mean, the reality is, I guess once you have human beings involved, then there would always be the temptation to want to influence outcomes. That's the nature of human beings, and particularly politicians. That's how, they are. They are creatures who, a win is the only thing that matters for them. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure that there's something you could ever do to prevent the approaches.
Yeah.
But what you need to do is ensure that the persons whom you appoint are robustly independent. And, in most cases, you should also ensure that there's some level also of financial independence, so that there is a lessening, hopefully, of the tendency to be easily influenced, by, the views of external parties or external forces.
Thanks for that, Martin. I want to just get your perspective on a major talking point. Obviously, we heard the SRC, the Salaries Reviews Commission, and obviously the recommendation is to hike up the current package for top officials. Now, this is one, even in my monologue this morning, I would have mentioned, it's multiple limbs of consideration, because one, when we're talking about money, things get a bit funny. Two, we consider what's the package in the private sector, and that's why I could imagine some of the best and brightest go in the private sector, because that's not obviously an issue. They come in and the compensation is quite attractive and people put in some years there. And then we have to consider public service, people who are managing millions to run a ministry, keep the wheels turning, but at the same time a permanent secretary receiving $35,000, which, in all fairness, I think there could be a bump up in that regard. And even when we consider ministers, opposition, prime minister, president, the works. But the question is the timing, and how do we also treat with the real people on the ground who get the wheels to turn with their particular compensation package, which sometimes is just in a couple of hundreds, but we're looking at thousands for top officials. So it's one where it's a delicate balance, Martin, and I would really love to hear from you, your take on this particular development.
Yeah, so the thing is, it is really an unfortunate timing in terms of the recommendations coming out now, because when one considers the general scenario in the country where, there are lots of persons, Jason, who are living lives of quiet desperation. In other words, they're not coming out and, saying, what troubles or challenges they're going through. But, sometimes when you have the media highlighting their plight, like, for instance, I know CNC3 Media, they have, a series whereby they go out to depressed areas and depressed communities and they highlight persons. And you see some people living in some really, really challenging conditions. It really, it's like rubbing salt in the wound to then say, well, the country's top officials are deserving of a pay increase, and therefore we're going to give them a massive pay increase and, generous back pays, in the millions for some of them, that kind of thing. So, it's not to say that one is, not recognizing the value of the offices held by these persons. However, we must recognize one thing first and foremost, Jason. If it is you're talking public service and public office, you cannot be going into these offices with the view that, look, you are going there for enrichment. Because if that's the case, then look, forget it, go in the private sector and, build your business, work hard, do your thing there and get your enrichment there. So I always say that. So public service is a labor of love, basically. We have to recognize that. We are not going to say that, public officials ought not to be compensated properly and fairly. But when you have this comparison with the private sector, I think it's an artificial construct and it's one that ought not to be encouraged at all. Because if you have public servants sitting down there watching the private sector persons and saying, but that person's salary is so much more than mine, I should be getting that same. No, it's not the same thing at all. Sometimes the work and effort that is required by some of the top executives in private sector may be totally different from what is required in the public service. I always tell people, when you are running your own business, it's a totally different thing. You basically are on the clock 24/7, 365. You don't always have the luxury of, the long vacations, knocking off at 4 or 4:15, that kind of thing, So it's something that we must not encourage at all, this comparison between private sector salaries and public sector salaries. What we have to recognize, though, is that, look, for the sacrifice made by persons who opt for public office, they ought to be properly compensated. And it may not always just be in terms of raw salary. There could be other perks and privileges which could be built into the mix, which then tend to, basically soften the blow for the general public. So therefore, okay, yes, you have the concessions, which most of them get in terms of vehicle purchases and imports. Then maybe you could add other things, in terms of maybe, purchasing property or, give some exemptions there, which could, make it a little more palatable for the public. So it also makes it easier for the public officer to say, well, okay, yes, all right, even though I'm making a sacrifice, there are these requisites which I can, look towards to say, well, look, this will help me in terms of that type of adjustment, instead of always looking at it in the raw numbers of a salary increase, because I think that is where the public, the numbers are in your face in that regard. And I think that's where the situation becomes a little bit dicey in terms of the justification to the public as to why these large increases are, justified to public officers, high public officers, but yet still the ordinary public officers down the line, as you said, the ones who actually do most of the bulwark and the heavy lifting, they are not getting an increase, or at least nothing comparable to that. And then you have the port workers who are complaining, you have TNTech workers complaining, so you have lots of persons out there who are also saying that, look, things are difficult for them. Yeah. So they're saying, well, then why is it that you only, so to speak, fixing the high office holders?
You know, it's such an interesting perspective, Martin, as we wrap things up, because yes, I think you brought it back to your personal ethos, you know, that personal conversation as to, I'm coming into the public service to serve country. Yes, of course, you want to live comfortably and all that, but I guess it's a different mindset. I go back to what former Minister of Finance, Brian Quaitong, would have said when he declared he's not taking any vow of, remember that? He said he was taking
poverty. He said that he took no vow of poverty.
Right.
Yes.
I remember that.
Yes.
But, you know, it's such an interesting one, Martin. We'll have to probably stick a pin now. And we'll continue with the discussion, but by all means, thanks for taking the call and giving us some perspective this morning. Have a great one.
It's indeed a pleasure. It's indeed a pleasure, as always.